Hey everyone, this is Andy Hall. You are going to learn things today. You are going to learn things you didn't know about Christmas. I have with me Dr. David Kyle Johnson. I'm going to read a bit of his bio right here and right now. Dr. David Kyle Johnson specializes in and has published on logic, critical thinking, metaphysics, philosophy of religion, and philosophy of science for journals such as Sophia, Religious Studies, Think, Philo, Science, Religion, and Culture, and SHERM, Socio-Historical Examination of Religious and Ministry. He also teaches for the Great Courses, edits, and writes regularly for the Wiley, Blackwell Philosophy and Pulp Culture series, and maintains two blogs for Psychology Today, Plato on Pop, and A Logical Take. He is the author of The Myths That Stole Christmas and the editor of the Palgrave Handbook of Popular Culture as Philosophy. Johnson's CV, along with all of his work that are legally allowed to be shared for free, is available at academia.edu. Sir, how are you today?
That's quite the bio. Thanks I'm doing great, Andy. Thanks for having me on.
I hope COVID I hope you don't have COVID, and I hope your family, no one's been touched by it.
So far, well, not my sort of extended family. A couple people got it in my extended family, but in my household, we are all good so far.
That's good to hear. I just want to dive, right into the book because I'm really excited about the book. Like I mentioned, there were things I didn't know about Christmas. And
I try to communicate that in the very cover of the book, right? With this is a postcard from the early 1900s, and it immediately forces you to ask, why is Santa stuffing a boy in a sack? Right? Like, how was that ever a thing? Only 100 years ago, that was a thing. Why in the world does that even exist? How is that part of Christmas? Right. And so I'm kind of trying to, from the very get-go, get you to realize that there's a whole slew of stuff about Christmas that you didn't even know that you didn't know. It's a good way to put it. That you didn't even know that you didn't know.
What I liked about the book, too, is that it was chock full of information, but the prose was not dense, very accessible. But once again, a lot of information that the reader can consume.
Oh, thanks. I really try to shoot for that in most of my writing. My really academic articles are a little bit too dense or whatever to get through, right? But I try to do a lot of writing for the general public, and when I do, I try to do it in a way that's understandable. It's dense. There's a lot of information there. You may have to read it a couple times to really get everything or whatever, but it's not ununderstandable. It's not something that you can't track, that you can't kind of figure out if you just kind of read carefully. As opposed to, there's some analytic philosophy that's that way, that only analytic philosophers can understand it because it's so kind of obtuse. It's kind of like we have our own jargon in the same way that medical literature and lawyers have their own jargon. And if you're not in that field, that you can't understand it. I really try not to write that way. The average person can't understand this. I try to do that with Great Courses. That's one of the reasons I think I was asked to do Great Courses, is because I have that kind of approach. And of course, I try to do this with this book, which this book actually came out of a class that I taught at King's College on Christmas. It was a kind of a labor of love that started for multiple years. I started getting interested in it, and I taught this class where we read a whole bunch of books about it or whatever, and then essentially all of that reading and classwork eventually kind of got culminated into this book. So it was a labor of love in a certain kind of way, but I've taught a class on it multiple times. But it's been a couple of years. I haven't taught that class in a couple of years because King's restructured things a little bit. But
sure. Is there a section of the book you wanted to take a moment and read from?
Well, I can do that now, although I think it might be more appropriate to do it after we talk about it a bit. I've got a section I think is interesting when we talk about the traditions and where the traditions come from and how most of our traditions are not nearly as old as we think they are. And when we think about one of the actual oldest traditions is charitable giving. But I want to talk a little bit about the section I have is about that. So when we get to it, there'll be a point where I'll say, this is where I want to read the section in the book, I think.
Sir, as we've talked a couple of times, as you are probably aware of, I am not a tinfoil wearing person. I do not believe in Bigfoot, alien abductions, but when I read your book, it's like, dang. And yes, I'm going to use such brash language. Dang, there seems to be a conspiracy about Christmas. And it isn't the war on Christmas, which you dedicate a whole chapter to, but there seems to be a conspiracy around the holiday.
Yeah, to define what you mean. I think I see what you're going for, what you're thinking of as conspiracy. But tell me more about what you see as the conspiracy.
I see it as various powers, different people at different times, utilizing or inserting information, traditions, rituals into this event that furthers their gains. And they Trojan horse these things, and they knowingly, I'm going to say it, they knowingly lie.
Yeah.
To further their own ends.
Yeah.
If that isn't a conspiracy, I don't know what is.
Yeah, good. I think this is a really good. So this is what turns out to be one of those conspiracies that turns out to be true. There's a couple of them here, right? In the early history of Christmas, in the early history of the holiday, I should say, there was a religious conspiracy, right? There was an existing celebration around this time of year, Saturnalia, celebrations of the sun god's soul. Those are two different things, but those traditions were in the Roman Empire, and the Catholic Church conspired. The early Catholic Church, like Constantine and that kind of stuff, essentially conspired to hijack those celebrations and make them about Jesus when they weren't about Jesus to begin with, right? And there's no reason to think that Jesus was born on December 25th or anything like that, but they just declared that to be Jesus's birthday, so they essentially could tack on the religious elements, the Christian elements, to this already existing holiday. As I try to explain in the book, essentially what happened was that Constantine converted to Christianity, but his entire army worshipped Sol Invictus, right? And everybody else was celebrating Saturnalia or something, like that, like a harvest festival at that time. And if he was going to make the Roman Empire Christian, right, he couldn't very well do that, but have everybody celebrating these non-Christian holidays. He couldn't have the biggest celebration of the year be a non-Christian celebration. And so essentially what the church does is declare, well, yeah, what we're really doing is celebrating Jesus, because Jesus was born on that day. And the public essentially said, do we still get to celebrate? Yeah. Okay, fine. You can say what it's about, whatever. Right? Like, we don't care as long as we still get to have our party. And then, of course, over time, people forget what they were originally celebrating, and it does become to be seen about Jesus. But that is not at all where the celebrations came from. And throughout the Middle Ages, the church conspired to try to Christianize the holiday, to make it about Jesus in more than name only. And it only actually became known as Christmas until about like the 1100s. And it gets that from Christ's Mass. That was the Mass that was like the earliest Mass you could go to end your fast, essentially, was Christ's Mass. And so people call it Christmas. But it's even once it was finally called Christmas in the 1100s, it was still celebrated in a completely raucous and secular way. It was feasting, drinking, and sex is how you celebrated Christmas. And that was true throughout the Middle Ages, despite the Catholic Church's attempts to try to make the holiday religious in more than just name only, right? So much so, it was so secular, it was so raucous, that the only organization, the only group to ever actually wage a war on Christmas was the most Christian of them all, the Puritans, who outlawed Christmas celebrations in early America because they were so debaucherous. They were just drinking and sex, and cross-dressing was part of it as well. They banned those celebrations. You couldn't even take the day off work unless it was a Sunday. Unless December 25th happened to fall on a Sunday, you better be working on Christmas Day. If you were,
Can you talk a little bit more about the cross-dressing?
Basically, it was just part of some of these Christmas celebrations when people would get drunk and that kind of stuff. It was like a kind of like a costume party, I think Halloween-ish, right? And people just thought it was funny to dress up as the other sex, right? And so this could have been part of Christmas celebrations in general, Christmas parties. It would have very, very likely been part of wassailing. Wassailing was this tradition where you would go house to house. No, I'm sorry. Well, that's kind of what it became. But wassailing often was a tradition where poor people would go to rich people's houses and essentially demand the best food and drink, especially if the poor people happened to work for the rich person in question. That it was this day of social inversion where the poor were kind of king for a day. And so this was especially true in rich households that had servants, the servants kind of had the right on Christmas Day to basically barge into the main house and demand the best food and drink of the house, and they were kind of the owners were kind of obligated to give it to them as this kind of this sign of well wishing. This is where "We wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year" comes from. Now bring us some figgy pudding, and we won't leave until we get some. It's the wassailing song is where that has its origins.
I've been dating my girlfriend for a couple of years now, and every single Christmas we spend together, the figgy pudding issue comes up. She'll turn to me and she goes, "I don't understand what this is." And it's like, I don't understand what this is either. I read the section of the book and I turned to her and I go, "I'm going to tell you what this figgy pudding is all about."
I love it.
Dr. David Kyle Johnson, because it's extortion. It seems like extortion from the lower classes, you know. It's this weird trick-or-treating with a real threat of with songs and this undercurrent of potential violence.
Yeah, absolutely, right. But Stephen Nussbaum in his book, The Battle for Christmas, calls it totally is extortion, but it's a social safety valve to make up for the other extortion that happens the other days of the year, right? So in other words, these servants have been extorted all year long, right? And so essentially we're going to come back and extort you for a day. And if you give in and kind of give us your best foot, well, you prove you're not such a bad guy. And that kind of keeps us happy for another year of you extorting us or whatever. So Nussbaum calls it this kind of the social safety valve, that where there's this kind of pressure that's released on that day where, you know, the poor get to take advantage of the rich for that day. And that makes the reverse happening every other day of the year sort of okay. And that's why there was this real tension in New York City. This actually leads to the domestication of Christmas. Like that ritual worked when you had servants that worked directly for masters, because the servants knew the masters knew the servants. It makes sense to open up your house to people that you know, even if they're, you know, your servants, right? But what happened with the Industrial Revolution in New York is that people who had servants no longer knew them. They were, you know, industry owners. They were factory owners that had all of these employees, but they didn't know them from Adam, right? They didn't know, right? And the employees didn't know their employer from Adam, right? They didn't know where they lived, and they didn't have the right, as it were, to get in their house. And so New York, especially, became at Christmas time became this time where, like, all of these poor people who worked in these factories thought they were owed, and they kind of were, this right of wassailing, but they had nowhere to go. They had no master, as it were, to go to their house. And so they just started roaming around randomly, knocking on rich people's doors, demanding entrance and food and drink. And they were like, the rich people were like, "I don't want to let these people into my house. I don't know who these people are," right? And so they would not let them in. And so they would turn violent. And so it was kind of an uncomfortable thing to be a rich person in New York, right? At that time, which this puts an entirely different light on that famous "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" poem, right? "'Twas the night before."
That's a propaganda piece.
Say again?
That's a propaganda piece.
It is. It is a propaganda piece, right? So it puts a different context on it. It's Christmas Eve. Everything was the night before Christmas. All through the house, not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. And then all of a sudden, there's this giant noise on the lawn. I throw open the shutters to see what's going on, because what he thinks it is wassailers. He thinks poor people are about to try to demand entrance to his house, right? But instead, it's St. Nicholas, right? And he sneaks into the house, but he doesn't come to take. He comes to give to the children, right? And so this was a way of, like, this was rich people propaganda, right? Trying to change the way that Christmas was celebrated. You think that at the time people already did the St. Nicholas thing. They didn't do the St. Nicholas thing in a large degree. Mainly what Christmas was at the time was wassailing. It was drinking and people trying to get in your house, that kind of stuff that was going on, right? And the rich people didn't like that because it was poor people trying to get into their house. And so the night before Christmas was essentially this propaganda piece that was written and popularized to try to change the way that Christmas was celebrated, to try to domesticate it, to try to make it about giving gifts to children rather than giving gifts, food and drink to the poor, right? And it largely succeeded in doing that, in domesticating the holiday and making it about kids rather than giving directly to the poor in this wassailing ritual, right? Right. And so that's like, this is a pretty, like, we think that Santa Claus goes way, way back or whatever. It doesn't really. It was kind of invented in the early 1800s, and it's survived. It's been modified, of course, since then, but it's survived from then. But it's only a tradition that's about 200 years old. There's a few places in Germany and that kind of stuff where you can find some St. Nicholas and Krampus traditions and that kind of stuff that are precursors to it, but they weren't nationally popular. They were little kind of niche things in certain towns or whatever. It is not this kind of centuries long tradition to have St. Nicholas come to your house and give gifts to the kids. That is not a long tradition.
Yeah, that's what's interesting, is that these people wanted to wrap these new traditions in an old-fangled way, so that people would just accept them easier. It would just find them easier to swallow. Yeah,
and so you really get that impression with the Night Before Christmas is trying to do that. Some of the other publications that talk about St. Nicholas are trying to do that, to try to dress it up in this garb. Is that these Christmas traditions are really, really old. What's his face I forgot his name off the top of my head, but his History of New York, the Knickerbocker History of New York, is trying to do this, telling this story about these old-timey Christmas celebrations that happened in the 1700s or whatever, that would have never actually happened like that. It is this, everything tries to immediately get this veneer of being old-fashioned as soon as it's invented, because we want our traditions to have that kind of link to the distant past, but they don't really have that. The only tradition that does, and this is where I can read a little bit from the book. The only tradition that actually does date back thousands of years is giving to the poor. Is this social inversion of practice of essentially making the poor king for a day. This goes all the way back to old like Mesopotamian rituals, where they literally would make a prisoner king for a day so that he could be executed at the end and help go down to the underworld and help defeat the gods of chaos. That eventually turns into something like Saturnalia, where everyone gets an equal seat at the table and the poor can eat and all that kind of stuff. And so there's a big social inversion that happens there, and that does continue throughout the ages. There are kind of king for a day traditions. Boxing Day in Britain, right, is this where the servants are made master for a day. There's an inversion in the military, that kind of stuff. Boxing Day has that tradition. But what's interesting that happens in the Americas, and generally in the West with Christmas, is that when Christmas becomes domesticated, and so it becomes less about wassailing and having these big parties and social inversion with the poor, and instead the social inversion happens in the household, and so you give, like, kids are king for a day in a certain kind of way on Christmas. That what happens is there's a shift. There's that shift to the kids. There's still some giving to the poor. There's still charity at Christmas, but it happens in a different way. You don't give directly like you used to. Right? You don't give directly to your servants or whatever, because you don't have servants anymore. And instead you go through organizations. It becomes uncouth to give directly to beggars in the street. It becomes uncouth to give directly to the poor. You give to organizations whose job is to take care of the poor. Right. And so this is where I have a little section of the book I want to read. I'll just dive right into it here.
Sure. Go right ahead, please.
As previously discussed, the domestication of Christmas turned Christmas's focus away from the poor and onto children. Treating one's servants as king for a day was replaced with treating one's child as king for a day. But that didn't mean that charity to the poor disappeared altogether as a Christmas tradition. After all, as we learned in myth number 1, social inversion is one of the oldest holiday traditions. Recall the Asian Mesopotamian tradition of appointing a peasant or criminal as king for a day. Recall the old Saturnalia tradition of the rich serving food to the poor. But the domestication of Christmas did make charity to the poor take on a different form. To be sure, the importance of giving to the poor declined. Since giving to the poor was no longer the primary way one expressed charity at Christmas time, the poor simply got less attention and less money. But the primary way that charity to the poor changed was by becoming something that one did from a distance, unlike a Christmas wassail, which had fallen out of favor because of industrialization. Once Christmas became domesticated, charity to the poor was almost always something that one did remotely through an organization to which one would donate money. We see this kind of giving in A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. At the beginning of the book, Scrooge refused to give money to gentlemen asking for donations to the poor. After his conversion, Scrooge catches up with them and promises a large sum of money. But no beggar ever approaches Scrooge, and Scrooge never gives to one directly. His social obligation to such charitable giving is fulfilled simply by giving money to someone else who would then give it to the poor. Dickens was not the only one to promote this idea. The press, the rich, and even those who were most concerned with helping the poor all pressed the notion that organized charities provided the most appropriate means for assisting the poor. "Do not give to street beggars," one headline read, discouraging face-to-face charity of indiscriminate giving. "After all, you might inadvertently give money to an imposter who, whenever you see one of these city pests approaching, button up both pockets." Even government programs to help the poor were opposed, despite the fact that the new capitalist economy of the 19th century regularly suffered severe economic depressions that created many unwilling, unemployed people. Such programs, it was thought, simply funneled money down to the poor without controlling how it was spent. How do you know they're not spending it on alcohol instead of food, many thought. Only private charitable organization could make such guarantees. In addition, private organizations were thought to be more efficient than direct giving. As the New York Times touted, if a man has money and does not know what that he can make the most of it, let him step into the offices of these excellent private charitable institutions in whose hands, if you place $1, can do what individually you could not make $5 do. One of the most noteworthy such charities was children. Okay, so here we go. Here's where it gets really good. One of the most noteworthy such charities was the Children's Aid Society, founded by Charles Loring Brace, who had concluded that charitable giving to adults was virtually useless, like pouring water through a sieve, because adults would often waste the charitable relief on alcohol or worse. Giving to adults only created a sense of dependency. Brace was convinced that poor families were poison to their own children, more likely to turn them into social dregs the social dregs their parents were. He thus advocated for and participated in separating children from poor parents so they could be raised by more affluent families in the West. To his credit, he didn't outright steal these children. He persuaded poor parents to give their children away. In all, he managed to transport some 90,000 boys to new homes and lives in the Western United States. He thought that life in the labor-starved, Protestant-dominated West would turn these New York vagrants into honest, hardworking Western pioneers. Unfortunately, Brace never bothered to track the progress of such children to see if the scheme actually worked. It gets better. Giving to charity was uncomfortable even to children unless they were deserving, the kind of ideal model of humanity that Dickens' Tiny Tim was. In reality, this was not the case. Many poor children were newsboys, the boys you see in old films selling papers on the corner and yelling, "Read all about it." Parentless and homeless, they were ruffians. Parentless and homeless, these newsboys were ruffians, street urchins who caused all kinds of trouble. Nevertheless, middle-class Americans were fascinated with newsboys, and so publications made them worthy of charity by idealizing them. Elizabeth Oakes Smith's The Newsboy does this. In reality, the newsboy hardly resembled the kind of real-life newsboy that Charles Loring Brace had to actually deal with. Charity to poor children was also a way to assuage the guilt that often came with spoiling your own children with gifts that they didn't need. Especially in the late 1890s, well-to-do Americans began making gift-giving to the children of poor part of their Christmas rituals. Stories about such giving portrayed children as extremely grateful, and they likely were, but the rich, seeing the children's happy faces and joyful voices, alleviated their fear that the urban social order was coming apart, that industrial capitalism was leading to social collapse. So in a way, the rich were exploiting the poor through charity, using them to assuage the guilt that the Gilded Age had heaped upon them. Unfortunately, this was not even close to the most egregious acts of such exploitation. So this is one of my favorite bits of the book. Rich New Yorkers began attending large dinners put on for the poor by charitable organizations. Of course, they did not partake themselves. Instead, they went to watch the poor eat from a distance. The likely largest such spectacles were put on, perhaps ironically, perhaps not, by the Salvation Army. Beginning in 1898, they rented out the Madison Square Garden and held a large dinner on its floor where they would feed thousands of poor people at a time. In what is now seen as a disgusting practice, they paid for the event, again, an event where they're on the floor of the Madison Square Garden, you have all these poor people eating this giant feast. They paid for this event by selling tickets for the garden's boxes and galleries to New York's more prosperous citizens, who would get all gussied up in their best attire, diamonds and all, and sit voyeuristically watching their poor, hungry fellow New Yorkers greedily eat. As a report in the New York World observes, some seem to look upon this feeding of the ravens as a spectacle, and whispered and pointed at poorly clad men and women who ate ravenously, or smiled when a piece of turkey was surreptitiously slipped into a capricious pocket. But the price of the tickets didn't cover all the costs. So the Salvation Army hired unemployed men to play the part of street corner Santa Claus, soliciting passers-by for contributions as they did their Christmas shopping. Yep, it's actually from these nefarious roots that the bell-ringing Santa you see every year comes. That was fun.
Yeah, but that was incredible, sir. That was incredible. People in the chat really enjoyed that too. The idea that wealthy New Yorkers would pay to watch people in deep, deep poverty to eat, basically just to feel superior.
Yep. And to feel superior and to feel good about themselves that they were helping doing this, right? But also kind of like making fun of them, essentially, like, ooh, look how hungry they are, right? Like, look at them stealing food, right? Like it's deplorable, obviously deplorable.
You know, it's interesting. We can pivot here to talk about. You have a whole chapter about Christmas economics, and somehow there seems to be a lot of hype around this time of year with the economy, and that there's this perception that, oh my God, if it wasn't for Christmas, the entire economy would crater.
Right. That's the myth.
That's the myth.
Right. Right. And so it should be, I guess I should note that, the book is called The Myths That Stole Christmas, right? And so it's essentially 7 myths that have hijacked the holiday. The first myth is that Jesus is the reason for the season. The second myth is that there's a war on Christmas. The third myth is that our traditions are old-fashioned. The fourth myth is that Christmas spending is good for the economy. I'm going to argue that it's not. The fifth myth is that Santa is Saint Nicholas. He's not. The sixth
that blew my mind too. That just blew my mind.
That's my favorite chapter, by the way. But the sixth myth is that lying to your kid about Santa is perfectly fine. And then the seventh myth is just that Christmas can't change. So we're talking about.
I got a lot to say about the Santa lie.
Okay, trust me.
I got, being a parent, I got some opinions about that, which are pretty much congruent with what you're writing about in the book. But continue, please, sir.
Cool. So, but you want to talk about the fourth myth about Christmas spending being good for the economy, right?
Yes.
It's not. There's a number of ways that it's not. One way is that it encourages to incur credit card debt, and that just weakens the economy. Essentially, like just blows up the credit bubble that will eventually burst and put us all in big jeopardy. Secondly, it forces us to spend money that we don't have on stuff that we don't need. And in this kind of way, it also increases what economist Jared Wadfogel calls deadweight loss, where essentially we buy stuff that we don't need or pay more than what stuff is actually worth to us. Right. So this deadweight loss is if you spend $100 on a gift that's actually only worth $10 to the person who gets it, that's $90 essentially of wasted money. Right. And that's deadweight loss. Now, the government does this too. The government will spend more on projects than they're actually worth. Right. They'll spend $1 million on a bridge that's only worth 10,000 or something like that. It'll spend $1 million. It may cost that much to whatever, but like the actual benefit to society is only $10,000 worth of benefit because not enough people use the bridge or whatever, right? And so that's called deadweight loss. But it turns out that Christmas spending creates more deadweight loss than all government pork barrel spending combined. If you don't like the government wasting money like that, you should hate Christmas because Christmas creates way more deadweight loss than government spending does, on the order of billions and billions of dollars of deadweight loss in the economy. But the other thing about Christmas is that it turns the economy kind of upside down, where it forces us to spend our first dollars on frivolities instead of having a spending on like the necessities, where we should be kind of making sure to prop up the necessary industries and that kind of stuff. And instead we're propping up the jewelry industry and the entertainment industry and that kind of stuff with Christmas spending. But in addition, it's just false that Christmas spending is like the economy depends on it. All Christmas does really is concentrate our spending at the end of the year, right? Like we're going to spend that money right? We've got the money, we're going to spend it, or we might save it. But even if we save it, that's really good for the economy because that can throw down interest rates and make more other kind of spending available and that kind of stuff. If we save it, but if we've got the money, we're going to spend it. It's just Christmas kind of forces us to spend it all at the end of the year. There's a number of purchases we put off because I won't get that now. I'll get it as a Christmas gift or buy it as a Christmas present or whatever. But like we would spend that money regardless. It's not like we're just going to sit on it and hide it in our mattress or something like that. We'll spend it. What Christmas does, it just forces us to spend it at a particular time, right? Think about the fact that China and India, right, and Japan have perfectly strong economies.
Yeah.
Without Christmas spending, right? Without concentrating all their spending at the end of the year, right? It just kind of moves stuff around. It's not essential for the economy at all. And if people started spending less at Christmas times, that just meant they would spend more at other times, and it would all essentially just balance out.
And more than likely, if they were going to spend it throughout the year, they would have more time to reflect on how they're spending their money. Because, it's a basic economic principle that you should never buy something when you absolutely, absolutely, absolutely have to buy it, when there's a timeline to it, because you're not capable of making rational decisions that way.
Right. Right. No, I think that's exactly right. And think about how, if people didn't have the pressure to buy the kinds of gifts that they do, how much less deadweight loss there would be, right? Like just because, think about think about how much crap you've got for Christmas that, I'm looking at some of it right now in my attic, right? Like I'm looking at stuff that I know that I've got for Christmas that I haven't touched in years, right? And I didn't ask for, but somebody got it for me, right? It's just a part of Christmas that is so dramatically wasteful. But
I'll tell you this funny story. When I was married, my ex-wife, married at the time, my then wife, said one day, right around Christmas, like maybe in November, she said, Andy, we should just forgo giving presents this year and just donate everything to charity. And I'm like, fine, that is not even a question for me. Consumerism I've never been hip and jowl with consumerism to begin with. And, you drop that down, I will pick it up, and I'm 100% in that. And then she realized what she had just said. And she quickly walked that back.
But this is actually, she was onto something here. This is actually the one way that Christmas gift giving can create some economic benefit, is by taking money from up here and putting it down here. And that can happen in the form of gifts, right? If I buy you something that you would otherwise have bought, I free up whatever money you would have used to buy that thing. And so it's essentially transferring money down. That actually creates economic benefit. Giving cash up does not, right? If somebody makes more money than me, a lot more money than me, $100 to them is not worth as much as it is to me. And $100 is not worth as much to me as it would be to like one of my students or something like that, right? It doesn't make any sense to give your professor a gift. It would make sense for your professor to give, gifts to students. Not that I do that, I give gifts to students, but that would make sense to go down the economic ladder in that kind of way, right? Right. Bosses should give presents to their employees, not the other way around. That doesn't make sense. And so this is the one way that you can actually create economic goods at Christmas time, but it goes back to that original oldest tradition of giving to the poor. That's the only thing that actually does create economic benefit, is charitable giving at Christmas time. But generally speaking, giving gifts, exchanging gifts between your family, at best, what you're doing is, here's $10. Okay, I'll take $10. Like that's at best, you're just moving cash around. Right. Yeah. At worst, I'm spending $100 on something that's worth $10 to you. Great. I'll spend $100 on something that's worth $10 to you. Yay. Right. Like that's not great. That just creates weight loss. That money would have been better given to charity.
You dedicate 2 chapters to the hype around Santa Claus. I would be remiss if we didn't touch on Santa at least a little bit, since there are 2 chapters dedicated to jolly old Saint Nick. Yep. In the book. And what blew my mind is that Santa Claus is not St. Nicholas.
He's not.
Talk about that.
So it's you would think like, oh, well, St. Nicholas is just another name for Santa Claus. That's kind of a recent invention, a kind of just so story to try to promote this myth that Santa Claus is St. Nicholas. And if you think about it, this makes sense. right? Santa Claus can't be St. Nicholas because no saint lives at the North Pole. No saint wears fur. No saint delivered presents to children annually on Christmas, including St. Nicholas. St. Nicholas did not do this. That is a just so story that came later.
That's what I found interesting, is that the common myth is that this St. Nicholas of, what is it, Myra, I believe, he, as I understand the myth, is that the man just gave presents to young kids, and so that's how he somehow transformed into Santa Claus over time. But that's not true.
No, not at all. Not at all. In fact, as I argue in the book, it's very likely that St. Nicholas never actually existed as a historical person. That's very, very likely. And if he did, that's all we would know about him, is he was a historical person, but we know nothing else about him. Everything else about him is lore. There are no historically reliable stories at all about him giving gifts to children. The only kind of gift-giving story there is about St. Nicholas is this story about, this is a great story, this father who was going to have to sell his daughters into prostitution unless he married them off. But he couldn't afford to marry them off because he didn't have a dowry. And St. Nicholas found out about this and was like, oh, I'll give him a dowry so he can marry off one of his daughters so he doesn't have to sell them in the prostitution. And he did, and the father sold her off to get married, and so he didn't have to become a prostitute. And St. Nicholas said, oh, well, that's nice. I'll do it again for the second daughter. And then he did it again for the third daughter. The third time he got caught. And St. Nicholas said, well, don't tell anybody. I want my charity to be anonymous, which obviously the existence of the story would indicate that the father didn't keep on that promise, right? It turns out, however, that this story is exactly similar to one that was told about another person, Apollonius, I think his name was, like 2 centuries before. It's clearly Apollonius' story. Somebody just lopped St. Nicholas's name onto it. So St. Nicholas did not do that. But that's the closest kind of story we even get about giving gifts to children. He wasn't even giving gifts to children. He was giving gifts to a father so he could sell his daughters to a husband rather than sell them off as prostitutes, right? This is not at all like giving gifts to children. This is, by the way, however, why St. Nicholas is the patron saint of prostitutes. But I'm not making that up. He is. Damn it. But if you look at what Santa Claus does, it's nothing that St. Nicholas did. There's nothing at all similar to what St. Nicholas actually did. St. Nicholas did not wear fur. He did not say ho, ho, ho. He was not an annual visitor. Where in the world did this stuff come from? Well, it turns out that, long story short, and again, it's all in the book. I got this all documented. All the research is there in the footnotes to prove that I'm not making this stuff up and that kind of stuff. But it looks like what St. Nicholas actually probably is a Christianization of this old pagan god called the Wild Man. So the Wild Man was an annual visitor. The Wild Man was this half man, half goat, half creature, like half wild creature that old pagan societies believed in, that they thought was kind of tied to the earth. And so that the fact that it was dying is why winter set in and all the trees would die. And then it was reborn every year is why spring would return and all that kind of stuff. And they thought they had to facilitate this return by essentially capturing the Wild Man, bringing him into town, sacrificing him, and having him be revived. And the way that this would often work is that somebody, like a priest or something like that, would dress up as the Wild Man. They would lure the Wild Man out with some kind of young maiden or something like that, wrap him in chains, pull him through the streets, and then they would kind of pretend to kill him and then pretend to resurrect him. Sometimes he would have coitus or pretend to have coitus with the maiden in the middle of the street in the town square or whatever, and then that, like, her being pregnant was the rebirth of the Wild Man or whatever. There's different kinds of traditions that this took on. And this was a very, very famous tradition. This monster came to be known in various places as Klaus. This was like the Ruklaus was the rough Klaus. Different versions of it was Klaus. And what happened, it seems, is that as Christianity moved through Europe and it tried to Christianize the pagans, it's very well known that the church did this. What it did was try to essentially Christianize existing pagan deities, right? So this is where a lot of the Catholic saints come from, is they're just like Saint Martin is just the god Mars with, you can change the name a little bit and become Saint Martin, right? They tried to Christianize these pagan gods by making them saints, right? Well, it's, as I detail in the book, there's pretty good reason to believe that that's what Saint Nicholas is, that Saint Nicholas is just the Klaus sanctified, essentially, right? Because Klaus is German. That's just the nickname for Nicholas, right? And so essentially they make Klaus into Saint Nicholas and kind of saint him up. And one of the reasons for thinking this is that the first time that Saint Nicholas kind of shows up as an annual gift giver, he already has this creature in tow that is the wild man. It's this horned beast, furry thing that's now known as Krampus, or there's a couple of other names for him in different places in Europe or whatever. But like when Saint Nicholas first shows up, he already has this furry man in tow, and he's the one that will punish you if you've been bad and that kind of stuff, right? And essentially, it takes on different forms. Saint Nicholas is also known as Kris Kringle. Right, but it turns out that Kris Kringle just means Christ child, and the way that he got that name is that people found the Protestants didn't like the Saint Nicholas thing or whatever, and so they tried to replace him with something called the Christ child. The Christ child was just this little girl with blonde hair and candles in her hair or whatever, but it wasn't as popular as Saint Nicholas was, and so eventually the Kris Kringle, the Christ child, is just showing up with Santa and the Krampus in the background, and eventually she comes to the background, and Saint Nicholas just gets another name, Kris Kringle. But that's where the tradition comes from, and it kind of merges in and out in different ways. Sometimes they combine into one character. So there's this character that was made famous or a lot of people at least know it from The Office, called Belsnickel. Belsnickel is actually very famous here in Northeast PA, where I live. It's actually kind of where he gets his origins, and he's a furry Nicholas or a dirty Nicholas. It's just the Krampus character and the Saint Nicholas character pushed into one, and it's this kind of like horn-wearing sort of person, but in furs with bells and that kind of stuff. Krampus is in chains, and you hear the chains rattling, you know that Krampus is coming. Those chains turn into bells, essentially, and so it's hearing the bells jingle is how you know that Belsnickel is coming around. And essentially what St. Nicholas is just kind of a niceified version of Belsnickel, who wears the fur. Especially if you look at 'Twas the Night Before Christmas and look at the description that he has there, he is covered in soot from his head to his toe, right? He's a dirty little peddler. He's actually an elf. He's tiny. He's not a full-grown person in the poem. He's a tiny person. He's an elf. He's dirty. He's a peddler. He even has this stump of a pipe, which is indicative of his lower class. At the time, the rich people had these long pipes like you see in Lord of the Rings, right? And one of the instances of rebellion that poor people did, like people will do today, you'll buy a brand new pair of jeans and then you'll stonewash them and rip them and that kind of stuff to show that they're used. You would buy a long pipe and then you would break it and smoke the stump of a pipe to indicate that you're not like those rich assholes who smoke a long pipe. And so he had a little stump of a pipe where that was an indication of his status. So he is very much like the Belsnickel. And it's not until consumerism comes in and realizes that they can make money off this kind of idea of giving gifts to kids and that kind of stuff with Santa Claus, that Santa Claus becomes a full-grown rotund person, that he becomes personified essentially as a full-grown person. He becomes big and rotund. And he doesn't, one of my favorite little bits, and a lot of people know this, that he doesn't, his cloak does not become the traditional red and white. His outfit does not become the traditional red and white until the 1930s when Coca-Cola does an ad campaign and they make him Coca-Cola red and white. And so that's why if Santa Claus is not dressed in kind of like Coca-Cola colors, he doesn't look legitimate. He doesn't look like a real Santa Claus because Coca-Cola essentially hijacked the image and solidified it as Coca-Cola red and white.
That was the magic of branding right there, sir.
Absolutely. The magic of branding, right? And so it's so many things are come from that kind of our conception of so many things come from that kind of branding and advertisement campaigns and that kind of stuff. But
just pivoting a little bit because we're running down on time. Telling children that Santa isn't real, is that not the third rail of parenting?
Yeah, basically is, right? Like this is one of the things that you have to do as a parent is lie to your kids about Santa Claus. So in the 6th chapter of the book, I argue that this is a mistake, that this should not be done. It's not that people overstate this and try to make me a horrible Grinch person or whatever, which I am kind of like Grinch and Scrooge, the one that's at the end of those stories that understand the real actual importance of Christmas, that it's not about gift giving and it's not about, like it's about family. And anyway, it's about family and charity, damn it. It's not about all the damn presents. And it's certainly not about lying to your children. So my point is here is that it's a better parental practice to not lie to your kids about Santa. If you do, you're not a terrible parent. You could just be doing better by not lying to them. And one of the reasons that I think this is a number, I think it encourages bad behavior. You're essentially rewarding a child for a lack of misbehavior rather than rewarding them for actual good behavior. There is, it does not promote imagination. People say, well, what's wrong with promoting imagination in kids? It does not promote imagination. Imagination is when you know something is false, but pretend it's true anyway. You are not saying it's false, but we're going to pretend it's true. You are lying and tricking them into believing something is true when it's not. Yeah. That is not imagination. They do not, a Muslim does not use their imagination when they imagine Muhammad riding Barak, the horse, up to heaven. A Christian does not use their imagination when they believe that Jesus rose from the dead. They just flat out believe those things happen. Your children are not imagining that Santa is real. They're believing that it's real. If you actually wanted to encourage imagination, you would tell them that it's false, but say, we're going to play a game where we pretend that Santa is real. And I actually don't have any major objections to that. That's pretty much what we do in our household.
I have always told my kids that magic isn't real from day one. Magic is not real. I have also told my kids from day one, God isn't real also. To tell you the truth, I had to be a Santa agnostic because of familial pressures by the grandparents. I could tell the kids God isn't real, fine, a little issue, but telling them Santa isn't real would have put me into deep, deep trouble. Yep. However,
God in a certain kind of way.
How this played out. My daughter came in from school one day at when she was like in second grade, and she came up with this syllogism, and she did this little dance. And I've said this before, but I think it's relevant. She started doing this little dance. She said, "Magic isn't real. Santa is magic. Santa isn't real." And then she continued. Magic isn't real. God is magic. God isn't real.
But this is a reason. So this actually gets to the reason why everyone should be opposed to the Santa lie, both believers and non-believers. Believers should be opposed to it because essentially that logic right there follows. Right? Santa is just basically God light. And by lying to your kids about Santa Claus, and once they realize that was a lie, right? It's a very short connection between that. Well, if Santa doesn't exist and he does all these things God does, well, you told me these same things about God. How do we know that? I mean, it sounds like God doesn't exist either, right? And if the parent says, well, God is different, why is God different? Right? It basically primes them for disbelief. So if you want your children to believe in God, you shouldn't prime them for disbelief with Santa Claus, right? Yeah. But the reason that non-believers should not want their kids to lie about Santa is because should not want to lie to their kids about Santa is because it essentially is encouraging them to believe for no good reason, right? Essentially what you're teaching children to do when you lie to them about Santa and then you try to keep them believing for as long as you can. This is especially true when you try to keep them believing for as long as they can. When they ask you about it and they present evidence and you try to dismiss it and throw it away, especially with things like, well, you won't get gifts if you don't believe. And right, isn't it more fun to believe? You're encouraging them to think that it is okay to believe something simply because it's fun, simply because you want to, simply because it's convenient or it's comforting. Right. And essentially what you're doing is teaching them that it's okay to believe something without evidence. Right. Yeah. And that is not a critical thinking lesson that we need to be teaching our kids. And people will say, yeah, but they're just kids. Can they really learn those kind of lessons early on? Yeah, they can. In the same way that even before my child could say a word, I read to him in appropriate English and I used appropriate grammar. And I modeled the appropriate way to use language. Even before he could talk, I modeled all of that because I knew that even before he could talk, he was learning how to talk. And so I made sure to talk appropriately, correctly, so that he would learn the appropriate way to talk. In the same way, even before they can think critically, you need to be modeling and teaching critical thinking in them. Otherwise, they will learn the wrong lesson. Yeah, they can't do it yet, but you need to be modeling it early.
You raise a good point, is that, skepticism isn't just a toolbox of rationality. It's kind of like a personality trait. It's a stance.
Yes.
Of how to interact with the world.
Yes, it is. It is. This is why in my critical thinking class, one of the first things I have to do early in the semester, and this takes really all semester to kind of reinforce this lesson over and over, but early on, what I have to do is teach them to teach them to care about whether or not something is true. They have to care about whether or not their beliefs are actually true. Because if you don't care about whether your beliefs are true, it's like, I'm just going to believe whatever the hell I want. Critical thinking is useless. Because you can believe what you want from your couch at home, right? This is one of the actual ways that I do this, right? Like, if you don't care about true belief, if you don't care about knowledge and education, why are you even here? If you just want to believe whatever you want, you can do that for free from your couch at home. Why are you paying all this money for a college education if you don't actually care about true belief, right? And so a big part of critical thinking is not the skills. That is a big part of it, right? But another big part of it is just valuing the truth, valuing not being fooled. So like you talk about Plato's cave allegory and the people watching the shadows in the cave and that kind of stuff. That's a deplorable condition to be in, to be looking at the shadows, thinking they're real when they're not, to have false beliefs about the world, it's a pitiful condition to be fooled into believing the world is a way that it isn't, right? And you have to value that. And by lying about Santa Claus and saying, well, but it's funner to believe, so let's just believe, you're undercutting that message. You're undercutting that value. Saying, it doesn't really matter what you believe. True belief is worthless.
We covered a lot of space. We covered a lot of territory in our conversation. Is there something, and there's so much more to the book to talk about. We cannot give it justice in the time allotment. I have daddying things to do. I'm actually helping put up the Skeptic banner in right by the State House in Boston today. I got like a ton of things I got to do. Is there another aspect of the book, another piece of the book that you want to talk about before we leave?
I mean, the first two chapters, the second chapter about why the war on Christmas doesn't really exist. I think that's pretty fun. Yeah. It's one of my favorite parts is the first chapter talking about how Jesus is not the reason for the season, looking at the actual ancient history behind the holiday and that kind of stuff. One of my favorite bits is when you look at the two nativity stories, which are pretty late in terms of Christian history. Like, you have all of the writings of Paul and you have the Gospel of Mark before we even get to an attempted story at the birth of Jesus. But what's so fun about Matthew and Luke's stories is the fact that they were clearly made up by Matthew and Luke, because they are nothing like each other. They completely contradict each other. They tell an entirely different story about where Jesus was and where he went and what happened afterwards. They're completely contradictory. They cannot go together. And this pushing them together in the nativity scene and that kind of stuff, it just makes no sense.
Are you saying the nativity stories are conspiracy theories, sir, about the birth of Christ?
They're pretty stinking close, right? Like, I mean, basically, they're just so stories to try to account for things that people thought were true of Jesus that didn't quite make sense, right? So Jesus was from Nazareth, but the Messiah was supposed to be born in Bethlehem. So the Messiah can't be a Nazarene, but Jesus was from a Nazarene. How do you square that circle, right? Yeah. Essentially, both nativity stories are a different way, right? One has it that his parents did live in Nazareth, right? But they came to Bethlehem essentially, and that's where he happened to be born. And then they afterwards, right? The other story says that no, they lived in Bethlehem, was born, then they had to flee to Egypt because of Herod, and then later they moved to Nazareth, and that's why they give these two completely different stories about how he was born in Bethlehem, but he's really a Nazarene. And that they would just kind of adjust those story to essentially, people at the time were saying, Jesus can't be the Messiah. He's a Nazarene. He wasn't born in Bethlehem. Yeah, he was. He would just, and they give this kind of story about how those two things could be true together, right?
Sure.
And that's essentially what's going on in both those stories. They just do it in two, like Matthew and Luke didn't talk to each other, so they made up two different stories.
Fascinating stuff. The last question I'd like to ask, is there a topic outside of the book that you wanted to touch on? Not about links or where people can find you online, but is there something you just wanted to chat about that we didn't get around to?
About Christmas or
anything.
So before I do that, here's the map in the book that shows the two different stories of, like, one of these is Matthew, the other one is Luke, about how the stories don't go together at all. There's fun stuff like that all over the book. Different stuff that I want to talk about that we didn't get to or anything like that. We could talk about so many different things. I don't want to talk politics because I'll just get angry. I mean, we could talk all about, but I think things are so up in the air and that kind of stuff. We don't even know what in the world's going to happen 2 days from now. Yeah. So I can talk to you about the latest thing that I am working on.
Oh, please. Yeah. Talk about that.
Is, John Loftus is doing his final book and he's going to do it on the problem of suffering, the problem of evil. Yeah. And he asked me to write the chapter on skeptical theism. So what skeptical theism is, it's a very misleading name. That's actually the first sentence of the chapter, is it has a very misleading name because it sounds like they're skeptical of theism. Skeptical theists are skeptical of theism. And that's not at all what skeptical theism is. Skeptical theism is this idea that so there's arguments against God's existence that say that, look, here's examples of horrendous, seemingly gratuitous suffering that could not possibly be justified in any way. William Rowe used the example, a real world story about a young 5-year-old girl that was raped and murdered in New York City on New Year's Eve in like 1984 or something like that. He's like, there is no good that could ever come about that could come from that could ever justify it. There's no greater good that could be justified that could justify that kind of horrendous suffering, right? Or think about he uses the example of a fawn who was burnt in a forest fire and suffers for days before it finally dies. No good could ever possibly. This is gratuitous suffering. This is suffering that has no possible justifying good. And Rowe argues that since God's supposed to be all good, all powerful, and all knowing, he would prevent such things if he had that power. He clearly doesn't prevent them because they happen. So that's really good evidence, maybe not deductive proof, but that's really good evidence that God doesn't exist. The skeptical theist says, no, it's not. It doesn't count as evidence against God's existence at all. Why? Because God's inscrutable. We're limited. God's all knowing or whatever. So it's possible, although I can't even fathom what this could possibly be, but it's possible that God has reasons that we just can't understand for allowing the rape and murder of the girl, for allowing the fawn to suffer. And the argument is the mere fact that it's possible that God has reasons that we can't understand for allowing such things means that they can't count as evidence against God's existence at all. Not just that it can't disprove God's existence. It can't count as evidence against God's existence at all. That's skeptical theism. And my chapter in the book essentially explains why that is not the case. That is both mathematically false, and if it was true, it would be absurd. Micah said it's not actually skeptical. The reason it's called skeptical theism is because the skeptical theist says that we should be skeptical about our ability to understand God's reasons for allowing evil. That's why it's called skeptical theism, right? But you're right. I mean, it's not really skeptical, but that's why it has that name. Essentially, go ahead. I can very briefly explain the problem with it, but go ahead, Andy.
All of these kind of complicated answers to the question of evil that theists make, it always seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong on this, seems to boil down to God's answer to Job.
This is a very Job-like answer. The skeptical theism is very Jobish. Yeah. It's basically you can't understand my ways, and so you have no right to complain, essentially, right? It's a little different because Job was not questioning God's existence. Job was questioning whether he should be devoted to God. But essentially, it's the same kind of like, you can't understand me, so you have no right to essentially declare these things evil. So you have no right to doubt, essentially. there are two things wrong with the argument that I spell out in detail in the chapter. And he asked me to do this because I actually have a pretty lengthy paper on this, and another one where somebody replied to me and I replied to that reply. And so I kind of laid out all the math and that kind of stuff. And I do it in simplistic probabilistic calculus and kind of Bayesian, really, really complicated Bayesian calculus. But essentially, the first problem is that this is not mathematically sound. You can essentially, like, how evidence affects the probabilities of hypotheses is very well defined and very well understood. And if you just simply do the math, you see that this, like, seemingly gratuitous evil does reduce the probability of God's existence, even if you grant that he could have reasons that we can't understand. One of the analogies I use is that if I've got a friend is really good at costuming, and so sometimes he comes to costume parties kind of perfectly dressed, so you can't even tell that it's him. If I throw a costume party and I don't see him there, that's not proof that he isn't there, because he could have a really good costume that I can't tell that it's him, but it does reduce the probability that he's there. And it's the same thing with God. Yeah, it doesn't prove that God doesn't exist, but it does reduce the probability. The second problem, and there's a bunch of different kind of varieties of this, is essentially, if the skeptical theist is right and we should be skeptical or about our ability to understand God's reasons for allowing such evil because he's so beyond us, then really we should just be skeptical entirely about everything about God, including his existence. If he really is so big that we can't understand that aspect of him, then we can't understand anything about God, including his existence. And essentially, like, and I mean, you can think about it this way, and really it not only maybe leads to skepticism about God, it leads to skepticism about everything. Because it would entail that I can't know that the Holocaust was evil. Because for all I know, it led to some greater God. I mean, regardless of whether even God exists, for all I know, it led to some greater good down the line that actually justified it happening, right? Maybe even though 6 million Jews were killed, maybe it saved 6 billion Jews in some time in the future, right? Like it's absurd. Like, I mean, that's possible, right? But it's absurd to think that I can't know that the Holocaust is evil. One of the examples I give in the in the paper is that, like, from the skeptical theist point of view, an asteroid could come down from Earth and kill every organism on the planet except for the skeptical theist, who could die gasping the words, "Oh, it may not be evil. God might have a reason," and then collapses. Right? Like, that's absurd. It's absolutely absurd. But that's what actually follows from you can have no moral knowledge. You can't have knowledge of really anything. Right? Because, like, in the same way that for all I know, the Holocaust was good, for all I know, I'm dreaming right now. For all I know, we're in a computer simulation, right? If I let that kind of for all I know possibilities wreck my ability to know whether an evil is gratuitous, then I don't know whether I'm awake right now. I don't know whether or not
you can't pragmatically navigate the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And in fact, what it kind of reveals is skeptical theism really undercuts theism by showing it to be completely irrational. Like, the skeptical theist reveals their theism to be irrational, because essentially what you have here is an ad hoc excuse. An ad hoc excuse is an excuse that someone makes up to avoid the evidence that falsifies their hypothesis, and they make it up in such a way that it can't be falsified, right? So prime example of this is conspiracy theories, right? So conspiracy theories are kind of immune from counterexample, because no matter what evidence you produce to falsify the conspiracy theory, the conspiracy theorist can always say, yeah, I think they planted that evidence to throw you off the track.
Right.
So that you wouldn't, to get into the, that you wouldn't realize that there's a conspiracy, right? And so it has its ad hoc excuse built right in. Right. I demonstrate the irrationality of this in the chapter and also in my class by appealing to what I call the ultimate conspiracy theory. It shows that this line of reasoning, that's what they want you to think, these ad hoc excuses can actually be used to undercut the conspiracy theories themselves. So I would say to a conspiracy theorist, right? Yeah. So you think that the moon landing was a hoax and 9/11 was an inside job, and that the Earth is flat, and COVID's a hoax, or whatever, and like list off all these conspiracies, and Princess Diana and blah 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 blah. So that's that you believe all those conspiracies. Yeah, that's what they want you to think. Those conspiracies, those false conspiracies, were all planted by the real conspirators to throw you off the track, to keep you busy trying to debunk these actually true things so they can go off and do what they're really doing, right? It's completely unfalsifiable, but that also shows that it's completely irrational. that ultimate conspiracy theory is completely irrational.
Right.
This is all the skeptical theist is doing, right? They just have their ad hoc excuse built right into the theory.
When
right?
is that book coming out?
Say again?
When is the book coming out?
I'm not sure. I just turned in the article not too long ago. I was helping him with a different chapter in that book, so I'm not sure. My guess would be sometime in 2021, but I'm not exactly sure.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading it.
Oh, thanks. Well, I can send you a copy if you a copy of my early draft anyway, if you like. But essentially, that's what it does. It just kind of reveals it to be irrational. It's like no matter how evil it is, you just have this built-in ad hoc excuse to get yourself out of the evidence that demonstrates that theism is unfalsifiable and thus just as irrational as a conspiracy theory.
Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Andy.
Where can people find you online?
On Twitter, I'm Kyle8425, and I really don't check Twitter that much. On Facebook is a better place to kind of keep up with my work. I'm Dr. David Kyle Johnson on Facebook, and you can find, so when I have new articles, I post them there. When I appear on podcasts like this one, I post a link there, that kind of stuff. So that's the best place to keep up with me, like what's going on with me. With my work, if you want to look up any of my old papers, a lot of my work in the pop culture realm and that kind of stuff, or if you want the entire bibliography for one of my great courses or whatever, that's all on academia.edu. Just Google David Kyle Johnson, academia.edu. It'll pop up. My CV's there. A whole bunch of my stuff's there to download for free. So yeah, there you go.
Fantastic. Thanks everyone in the chat. Thanks again, Dr. Johnson. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Andy. Take care.
Take care.